What most people misunderstand about avoidance is that the dynamic has never really been about love. It's been about control, not in a manipulative, villainous sense, but in a deeply ingrained psychological way. Control for an avoidant is safety. It's how they regulate closeness, how they manage vulnerability, how they keep themselves from feeling overwhelmed. So when you're the one pursuing, texting first, reaching out, trying to understand, you're actually fitting into a structure they unconsciously rely on. You're predictable, you're available, and because of that, they can afford to keep a certain emotional distance while still knowing you're there. But the moment that changes, everything shifts. When you stop chasing, when you pull your energy back, when you treat them as if they no longer exist, you remove the one element they quietly depended on, your presence without pressure. And now something unfamiliar happens. The emotional equation they were comfortable with no longer works. This is where the real disruption begins, because absence, when it comes from you, is not neutral. It's loud, it's disorienting. It creates a kind of psychological silence that forces awareness. For someone who is used to controlling the pace of connection, your withdrawal feels like a loss of footing. Suddenly, they are no longer choosing distance. You are. And that distinction matters more than people realize. When an avoidant chooses space, it feels safe. When that space is imposed on them, it feels like rejection. And rejection is precisely the emotion they've spent a lifetime learning to avoid. So what you see on the surface might still look like indifference. They may not immediately reach out. They may not express anything directly, but internally, something has already been set in motion. A quiet recalibration, a subtle but powerful awareness that the dynamic has changed, and that they are no longer in control of it. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Your absence doesn't just remove you from their life. It removes the emotional buffer they used to rely on. Without you initiating contact, without you maintaining the connection, they are left alone with their own thoughts. And for someone who avoids emotional depth, that's not a comfortable place to be, because now they don't just notice your absence, they eat into inside some enso says and say and say and say the conscious of chew in and say says and say the ensign say and say and say and say this say can say and say some may and they and say bay and say. They start to question things they didn't question before. Why did you stop? What changed? Were you more important to them than they realized? These aren't questions they consciously want to ask, but they arise anyway because your absence has created space for them. And space, when it's no longer controlled, becomes confronting. This is the paradox. The very thing they claim to want, distance, becomes unsettling when it's no longer theirs to dictate. And in that moment, something shifts internally, not necessarily into action right away, but into awareness. And awareness is the first crack in any emotional defense. So when you stop chasing, it's not just a behavioral change, it's a psychological interruption. You're stepping out of a pattern they depended on, and in doing so, you're forcing them, without saying a word, to experience the very emotional uncertainty they've always avoided. And that's where your power truly begins. Because in a dynamic built on one person pursuing and the other withdrawing, the moment you remove yourself, you don't lose significance, you redefine it. And sometimes the most powerful way to be felt is to be gone. And once that shift happens, once your absence breaks the pattern, the next layer reveals itself. And this is where things become far more internal for the avoidant, because what you've really done is remove their sense of control. Now, control for an avoidant isn't about dominance over others. It's about emotional regulation. It's the quiet system they've built to manage closeness without feeling exposed. They decide when to lean in, when to pull back, how much to reveal, how much to withhold. And as long as they are the ones setting that rhythm, they feel safe, even if the connection itself is inconsistent. But the moment you stop playing your role in that rhythm, something destabilizes. When you treat them like they don't exist, you're not just creating distance, you're taking away their ability to manage it. And that's where anxiety begins to surface. Not loud, not obvious, not always visible to the outside world, but very real beneath the surface. Because now they're no longer responding to your presence. They're reacting to your absence. And that's a completely different psychological experience. You see, when an avoidant pulls away, it's a choice. It's intentional. It gives them a sense of relief. But when someone else pulls away, especially someone who was once emotionally available, that same distance starts to feel unpredictable. And unpredictability is what triggers the very discomfort they try to avoid. So Internally, questions start to form, not necessarily conscious at first, but persistent. Why did this change? Are you gone for good? Did they lose something they didn't fully understand while they had it? And with each unanswered question, the mind begins to fill in the gaps. This is where overthinking quietly takes hold. They may replay conversations, revisit moments, analyze your behavior in ways they never did before. And what's fascinating is that this isn't driven by a sudden desire for closeness. It's driven by the loss of certainty. The structure they relied on is gone, and now they're trying to make sense of a situation they can no longer influence. And that lack of influence is what creates internal pressure, because without control, there is exposure. And with exposure comes vulnerability, the very thing they've spent so long keeping at a distance. It's no longer neatly contained. It starts to leak into their thoughts, their emotions, even their sense of self. They may not admit this. In fact, most avoidants won't. On the outside, they might maintain the same composed, detached demeanor, but internally, there's a shift happening, a kind of quiet tension that wasn't there before. It's the tension of not knowing. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional independence, not knowing feels like losing ground. It challenges their belief that they can remain unaffected, that they can keep things compartmentalized, that they don't need to rely on anyone. Because now, whether they like it or not, your absence has created an emotional response they didn't choose. And that's the key. Avoidants are comfortable with emotions they can control. But when feelings arise outside of that control, when they're triggered by something they didn't initiate, it disrupts their entire internal framework. It forces them into a position they are not used to being in, reactive instead of intentional. And that's where the anxiety lives. Not in dramatic displays or obvious reactions, but in subtle unrest, in the quiet moments, in the thoughts they can't fully silence, in the realization that something or someone has affected them more than they anticipated. So what you've done, simply by stepping back, is introduce a level of emotional uncertainty they can't easily escape. You've shifted the dynamic from something they managed to something they must now face. And when control slips away, what replaces it isn't indifference. It's awareness under pressure, because the moment they can no longer control how they feel is the moment they're forced to finally feel it. And when that pressure builds, when control slips and anxiety quietly takes its place, is something even deeper begins to unfold. Because now there's nothing left to distract them from themselves. This is where silence stops being just an absence of communication and starts becoming a psychological mirror. You have to understand, avoidants are incredibly skilled at staying busy in ways that keep them emotionally disengaged. It's not always obvious. It can look like independence, productivity, even confidence. But underneath it, there's often a subtle avoidance of stillness, because stillness creates space, and space invites feeling. When you were present, when you were reaching out, when you were maintaining the connection, you unknowingly filled that space. You gave them something to respond to, something to manage, something to keep the focus slightly outside of themselves. But now, that's gone. And in its place is silence. No messages, no emotional cues, no reassurance, just a kind of stillness that they didn't choose and don't quite know how to navigate. And this is where reflection begins. Not because they suddenly decide to sit down and analyze their emotions in a structured way, but because the mind naturally starts to search for what's missing. Your absence becomes a question mark, and the longer that question goes unanswered, the more it pulls their attention inward. They begin to revisit moments, small interactions, things you said, things they felt, but didn't fully process at the time. And without the usual distractions, those moments don't just pass by. They linger. This is the part most people never see, because from the outside, it still looks like distance. It still looks like nothing is happening, but internally, something very real is taking shape. A slow, often uncomfortable confrontation with emotions that were previously suppressed. Regret may begin to surface, not always in a dramatic or obvious way, but as a quiet recognition that something valuable might have been taken for granted, that perhaps they misjudged the situation, that maybe your presence held more weight than they allowed themselves to admit. And alongside that, there's often confusion, because these feelings don't align with the identity they've built. Avoidants see themselves as self-sufficient, emotionally controlled, unaffected by relational intensity. So when reflection brings up attachment, longing, or even a sense of loss, it creates internal conflict. They don't just feel something, they question why they feel it at all. And that questioning deepens the process because now it's not just about you, it's about them. Their patterns, their reactions, their tendency to pull away when things get real. And for perhaps the first time, they're not analyzing you, they're analyzing themselves in relation to you. That's a powerful shift. Because awareness, once it begins, is very difficult to reverse. It doesn't mean they'll immediately act on it. It doesn't mean they'll suddenly become emotionally expressive or reach out with clarity. But it does mean that something inside them has been activated. Something that can no longer be ignored as easily as before. Your silence has created a space where truth has room to surface. And truth, especially for someone who has spent years avoiding emotional depth, is not always comfortable. It challenges their defenses. It exposes contradictions. It reveals needs they've long denied. But it also does something else. It humanizes the connection because when all the noise is gone, when there's no more back and forth, no more emotional buffering, what remains is the raw imprint of what was felt, even if it was never fully expressed. And that imprint doesn't disappear just because you do. It lingers. It echoes. It asks to be understood. So while they may have once avoided emotional depth by keeping distance, your absence has removed that option. Now, the only place left to go is inward. And in that space, they don't just remember you, they begin to understand you and themselves in a way they never did before. Because silence doesn't erase meaning, it reveals it. And as that awareness deepens, when reflection starts to uncover feelings they didn't expect to face, another layer begins to surface. And this one strikes at something even more fundamental, the ego. Because beyond the psychology, beyond the patterns and defenses, there is also identity, the way they see themselves in the dynamic, the quiet assumptions they've carried all along. Avoidants often operate with an unspoken belief that they are the ones who hold emotional leverage, not because they're trying to dominate, but because distance has always given them an advantage. When you're less available, less expressive, less invested on the surface, you appear less affected. And in most relational dynamics, the person who appears less affected tends to feel more in control. So over time, a subtle confidence forms. They begin to believe that no matter how much space they take, no matter how inconsistent they may be, the connection will remain accessible, that you will still be there, that if they ever choose to re-engage, the door won't be fully closed. And this belief isn't always conscious, but it's powerful because it allows them to move through the relationship without fully confronting the consequences of their distance. It creates a sense of emotional safety built on the idea that nothing truly significant will be lost. But when you step away, when you don't react, don't reach out, don't try to reestablish the connection, that belief starts to fracture. And that's where the ego feels it. Because now it's no longer about managing closeness or avoiding vulnerability. It's about facing the possibility that they misjudged their place in your life, that they assumed permanence where there was none, that they underestimated your capacity to walk away. And that realization doesn't just create discomfort. It creates a kind of internal dissonance. They start to question their own assumptions. If you're no longer there, if you're no longer responding, if you've truly detached, then what does that say about the dynamic they thought they understood? What does it say about their role in it? For someone who is used to being emotionally self-contained, this kind of questioning can feel destabilizing. Because the ego doesn't just want to protect them from others, it wants to protect their self-image. It wants to maintain the idea that they are in control, that they are unaffected, that they are the ones who choose when things begin and end. But your absence challenges all of that. It introduces the idea that they are not as central to your emotional world as they believed, that their withdrawal may not have made them more valuable, but instead more distant, replaceable even. And that's not an easy thing to sit with. So what often happens is a subtle shift from indifference to evaluation. They begin to reassess you, not from a place of detachment, but from a place of curiosity mixed with a hint of wounded pride. They start to look at your absence not just as a change in behavior, but as a statement that says you are no longer prioritizing them. And when that message lands, it forces them to reconsider something they rarely question, their own value within the connection. Did they take you for granted? Did they assume too much? Were they as significant to you as they believed? Or was that significance something they projected? These aren't comfortable reflections. They don't come with immediate clarity or resolution, but they do something important. They break the illusion of emotional certainty. And once that illusion is broken, the ego no longer has the same ground to stand on, because it's one thing to maintain distance when you believe the connection is secure. It's another thing entirely to maintain that distance when you realize it may have cost you something real. So what you've done without confrontation, without explanation, is challenge not just their behavior, but their perception of themselves within the relationship. And that's where the impact becomes deeply personal. Because when someone starts to question their own assumptions, their own value, their own role, they are no longer operating from confidence. They're operating from awareness. And awareness, when it reaches the ego, doesn't inflate it. It humbles it. Because in the end, it's not your words that challenge them. It's your absence rewriting the story they thought they were in. And once the ego has been challenged, once that internal certainty begins to crack, something even more compelling starts to take hold. Because when people lose clarity, they don't move on. They lean in. This is where curiosity begins to evolve into something far more intense. You have to understand, the human mind is not comfortable with unresolved narratives. When something ends without explanation, when a pattern breaks without warning, it creates an open loop. And open loops demand closure. They pull attention back again and again until something makes sense. Now, think about what you've done. You didn't argue, you didn't explain, you didn't give them a dramatic ending to process. You simply disappeared. Emotionally, psychologically, you removed your presence in a way that offers no clear interpretation. And that ambiguity is what fuels curiosity. At first it's subtle, a passing thought, a quiet question. Why did they change? What happened? But because there's no immediate answer, the mind doesn't let it go. It returns to it, replays it, tries to fill in the gaps. And the more it searches without resolution, the more persistent that curiosity becomes. This is where the shift happens. Because curiosity, when it's left unresolved long enough, doesn't stay neutral. It starts to carry emotional weight. It becomes personal. It becomes charged. And before long, it transforms into fixation. Not necessarily in an obvious obsessive way, but in a quiet recurring presence in their being. You cross their thoughts at unexpected times, a memory surfaces, a moment replays, something reminds them of you, and suddenly they're pulled back into the question they never answered. And what makes this even more powerful is that it's no longer about what you're doing. It's about what they don't know. Are you thinking about them? Have you moved on? Was the connection ever as meaningful to you as it was becoming for them? Did they lose you, or did you simply outgrow them? These questions don't just sit lightly. They carry implication, because every possible answer forces them to confront something different: loss, regret, insignificance, or even the realization that they misread the entire dynamic. And without communication, there's no way to confirm or deny any of it. So the then fills the silence. And here's where it becomes deeply psychological. The less information they have, the more their imagination steps in. And imagination, especially when combined with emotional uncertainty, rarely creates calm scenarios. It amplifies, it idealizes, it distorts. They may begin to remember you differently, not just as you were, but as something more significant, more impactful, more emotionally relevant than they allowed themselves to see before. Your absence creates space, and in that space, your value can grow. This is the paradox. When you were present, they could keep you at a manageable distance. But now that you're gone, there's nothing to regulate how they think about you. No interaction to balance the perception. No reality to ground the memory. So you become amplified. And that amplification is what leads to fixation. Because now it's not just about understanding what happened. It's about resolving a feeling they didn't expect to have, a pull they didn't anticipate, a sense of unfinished business that doesn't easily fade. And the more they try to ignore it, the more it tends to return, because it was never fully processed to begin with. So what started as a simple absence has now become something far more complex. You've become a question they can't easily answer, a presence they can't fully replace. A moment in their life that didn't end cleanly and therefore continues to live in their then long after you've stepped away. And that's the power of what you've created. Because when someone can no longer access you, no longer understand you, no longer predict you, they don't forget you. They think about you more because the mind doesn't chase what it has. It chases what it lost and never fully understood. And when all of that builds, when the curiosity lingers, when the questions remain unanswered, when the mind keeps returning to what it can't resolve, you step into a role you never had to force. You become the emotional trigger, not through effort, not through words, but through absence. But because at this stage, it's no longer about what you're doing. It's about what you represent. You've moved from being a person in their life to being a psychological experience within their mind. And that's a very different kind of presence. You see, avoidants are comfortable managing people. They know how to create distance, how to regulate interaction, how to keep things within a range that feels safe. But what they are not comfortable managing is something internal that they can't directly control. And that's exactly what you've become. A thought that interrupts, a feeling that surfaces unexpectedly, a memory that carries more weight than it used to. You're no longer part of their external environment. You're part of their internal landscape. And internal experiences don't follow rules. They don't respond to logic the same way. They don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. In fact, the more they try to suppress them, the more persistent they often become. This is where the real tension lives, because now every time they try to return to their normal state of emotional detachment, something pulls them out of it. A reminder, a question, a subtle sense that something unresolved is still there. And the key word here is unresolved. You didn't give them closure. You didn't offer a final explanation. You didn't create a clean ending that they could neatly file away and move on from. Instead, you left a space, an open emotional loop that continues to echo. And that echo is what triggers them, not in a dramatic outward way, but in a quiet, consistent undercurrent. It shows up in moments of stillness, in comparisons with other people, in the realization that something about your connection felt different and they never fully explored why. And over time, that trigger becomes more defined. It's no longer just confusion. It becomes contrast. They start to notice how others don't evoke the same depth, how interactions feel more predictable, more manageable, but also less meaningful. And whether they consciously admit it or not, your absence begins to highlight what's missing. That's when the trigger deepens. Because now it's not just about you, it's about what you awakened in them. A level of emotional awareness they weren't used to, a sense of connection that didn't fit neatly into their usual patterns. And without you there to engage with it, they're left alone to process something they never fully understood. That's what makes it powerful. You're not triggering them through presence, through persuasion, through effort. You're triggering them through contrast, through the quiet realization that something once existed and no longer does. And that absence doesn't just fade. It lingers as a reference point, a standard, a question that keeps resurfacing. Why did that feel different? And why can't I seem to replicate it? And the more that question repeats, the more significance it gains. Because in a life built on emotional control and distance, anything that breaks through that structure becomes memorable. It stands out. It resists being categorized or dismissed. And that's what you've become. Not just someone they knew, but someone they felt in a way that disrupted their usual sense of self. And disruptions like that don't disappear easily. They reshape perception. They influence future decisions. They create a kind of internal imprint that quietly affects how they experience connection moving forward. So even in your absence, you remain relevant. Not as a constant thought, not as an overwhelming obsession, but as something deeper. A psychological reference they can't fully ignore. Because in the end, the most powerful impact you can have on someone isn't through constant presence. It's through the space you leave behind, because that space is where meaning settles. And once something truly meaningful takes root, it doesn't need your presence to survive. It lives on in the one place they can't escape, their own mind. And when you step back and look at the entire dynamic, from the moment you stop chasing, to the loss of control, to the anxiety, the reflection, the ego being challenged, the curiosity turning into something deeper, you begin to see a pattern that most people completely miss. This was never about making them suffer. It was about removing yourself from a cycle where your presence was taken for granted. Because the truth is, you didn't become powerful by playing games, forcing reactions, or trying to prove your worth. You became powerful the moment you chose self-respect over emotional availability that wasn't being valued. And that's the part people struggle to accept. We're conditioned to believe that more effort creates more connection, that if we just explain better, try harder, stay longer, something will eventually shift. But with avoidance, the opposite is often true. The more you lean in, the more they lean out. The more available you are, the step of sounds, the set the sass, the step they feel the risk of losing you, until one day that availability is gone, and suddenly everything they once managed so easily begins to turn inward. But here's the deeper perspective, the one that goes beyond strategy, beyond psychology, beyond even the dynamic itself. This is not about controlling their reaction. It's about reclaiming your position. Because when you stop existing in someone's life who only valued you at a distance, you're not losing your place, you're redefining it. You're no longer the option they can return to when it's convenient. You become the experience they didn't fully understand until it was no longer accessible. And whether they come back or not is no longer the point, because real power is not in being chosen after absence. It's in no longer needing to be chosen at all. That's the shift. That's the transformation. You move from seeking validation to embodying value, and in doing so, you don't just change how they see you, you change how you see yourself. And once that happens, the entire dynamic becomes irrelevant, because you're no longer playing the role that kept you stuck in the first place. You've stepped out of it, fully, quietly, permanently. And that's why, in the end, the greatest impact you can have on someone who feared closeness is not chasing them into connection. It's walking away with clarity, because nothing unsettles confusion more than certainty, and nothing is more powerful than someone who knows their worth and refuses to negotiate it.